name is Ibrahim Traore. I speak to you not as a symbol, not as a slogan, but as a man who has learned, slowly and often painfully, that life does not belong to power, rank, or weapons. It belongs to God. I address Muslims and Christians, leaders of the Sahel, elders of Africa, and brothers and sisters across the world, especially those who have lived long enough to know that history is shaped less by noise than by quiet decisions made in the heart. The day that changed my understanding began as an ordinary day. It was Sunday, the 8th of February, 2026. In my country, most people see Sunday as a pause, a day to rest, to breathe. I did not. For years, I had trained myself to forget days, to erase holidays from my mind. A nation under pressure does not wait for the calendar, and neither did I. That morning, my thoughts were fixed on a military meeting near the northern border, close to a forward post known as Kutiala Nord. It was a sensitive zone. Intelligence reports were worrying. Morale needed strengthening. Emergency defense measures had to be aligned. I had prepared everything the night before, line by line, map by map. In my mind, there was no room for delay. As I dressed in my uniform, my movements were mechanical. I was already at the border in my thoughts. Then, something small interrupted that rhythm. In the pocket of my jacket, my hand touched an object I did not expect. A small Bible, old, worn, forgotten. An elderly priest had given it to me long ago. I had carried it without thinking, like a relic of another time. That morning, without knowing why, I opened it. The page fell open to a single sentence that seemed to look back at me. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. I froze, not because of fear, but because of clarity. It was Sunday, and for the first time in many years, the question was not about strategy or security. The question was simple. Was I willing to listen? I stood there longer than I cared to admit, holding that small Bible in my hands as if it had suddenly gained weight. It was not heavy in matter, but in meaning. The words I had just read did not accuse me. They did not threaten me. They simply reminded me of something I already knew but had learned to silence. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. I had read that line many times in my life. I had heard it preached. I had nodded politely at it. But that morning, it did not sound like doctrine. It sounded like a personal address. I looked at my uniform laid out before me, the insignia, the fabric pressed sharp and clean, symbols of authority, responsibility, command. Then I looked again at the Bible, a book with no medals, no rank, no protection detail. And yet, I felt more exposed holding the uniform than holding the word. My first instinct was to dismiss the moment. Leaders cannot afford to overinterpret coincidences. Nations are not governed by feelings. Security threats do not pause for spiritual reflection. That is what I told myself. Still, something inside me refused to move on. I checked my watch. Time was advancing exactly as planned. The convoy was ready. The route had been cleared. The intelligence brief was waiting. Everything in the visible world was aligned. Only the invisible world was unsettled. I sat down. That alone surprised me. I was not a man who sat down in the middle of preparation. Sitting felt like weakness, like delay, like indulgence. Yet I sat because standing no longer made sense. I opened the Bible again, not with intention, but with surrender. I did not choose a passage. I did not search. I let the pages fall where they would. This time my eyes met another sentence, quieter than the first, but sharper. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. I closed the book. That was the moment of real conflict. Not between belief and disbelief, but between two kinds of loyalty. Loyalty to duty as I defined it, and loyalty to duty as God might define it. I thought of my soldiers at the border, young men, some barely older than boys. I thought of their families, their trust. I thought of the risks they faced daily. Was it not my responsibility to be there, in person, to show them they were not forgotten? Then another thought rose, uninvited but persistent. What if leadership was not only about presence but about order? What if placing God second, even for noble reasons, was still placing him second? I felt no voice from heaven, no vision, no miracle, only an unease that would not leave me, a restlessness that logic could not calm. I realized something uncomfortable. I was afraid, not of danger, but of letting go of control. If I went to the meeting, everything followed my plan. If I went to mass, I stepped into uncertainty. Power teaches a man to trust his systems. Faith asks a man to trust beyond them. I weighed arguments as I had done 1,000 times before in war rooms and briefing halls. The meeting was critical, the timing sensitive, the region unstable. Every rational calculation told me to proceed as planned. But faith does not argue, it invites. I asked myself a question I had not asked in years. If God truly governs history, was my presence at that meeting indispensable? Or was my obedience more important than my efficiency? The thought unsettled me deeply. Leaders are praised for decisiveness, not for hesitation. Yet here I was, suspended between two paths, both claiming responsibility. I thought again of the priest who had given me that Bible. His hands were thin, his voice quiet. He had not asked anything of me. He had simply said, "Carry this," not for decoration, for memory. That morning, I remembered, I began to understand that the Sabbath was not about rest from work, but about rest from illusion. The illusion that everything depends on us. The illusion that urgency excuses disobedience. The illusion that God understands our priorities even when we do not understand His. I stood up, not with certainty, but with resolve. Whatever choice I made, it would reveal what I truly believed. This was no longer about Sunday, it was about order, about who comes first when everything seems important. And in that quiet room, with the uniform still untouched, I knew that delaying God was not neutrality, it was a decision in itself. The core message of this moment is simple. Faith is not tested when it is convenient. It is tested when responsibility gives us a reason to disobey gently, respectfully, and with good intentions. That morning, my faith asked me not for words, but for placement. After I stood up, the room felt smaller. Not physically, but morally. Every object seemed to ask me a question without speaking. The uniform, the documents, the keys, even the silence. I told myself I would leave in a few minutes, just a pause, nothing more. That is how compromise often begins. We tell ourselves we are only delaying, not choosing. But the unease did not fade. It deepened, evened. Responsibility has a powerful voice. It speaks in numbers, in risks, in consequences. It reminds a leader of what could go wrong if he hesitates. That voice had guided me for years. It had kept me alive. It had kept others alive. I respected it. Faith speaks differently. It does not raise its voice. It does not threaten outcomes. It simply asks where you stand. I walked to the window and looked outside. The day was clear, ordinary, no sign that anything significant was unfolding. That is how most turning points arrive. Quietly, without warning, disguised as routine. I thought about the word duty. In my training, duty meant showing up, commanding, deciding. In my upbringing, duty also meant obedience, humility, and reverence. Somewhere along the way, I had separated those meanings as if they belonged to different worlds. That morning, they collided. I asked myself whether I had begun to believe that my role excused me from submission, not in words, not consciously, but in habit. Had leadership slowly taught me that God would understand if I came later, if I put Him after security briefings and operational plans? The thought troubled me more than any external threat. I sat again, this time deliberately. I closed my eyes, not to pray eloquently, but to be honest. I told God exactly what I felt, that I was torn, that I feared making the wrong choice, that I feared being irresponsible, that I feared being seen as weak. And beneath all that, I admitted something harder. I feared that if I chose faith over urgency, I might never be able to justify that decision in human terms. No report would record it, no soldier would see it, no strategist would praise it. Faith, in that moment, offered no visible reward. Then I remembered something simple. God does not ask leaders to be understood, He asks them to be faithful. I opened the Bible again, not to read, but to hold it. I realized that what disturbed me was not the risk of missing the meeting, but the possibility that I had already begun to believe I was too important to miss anything. That is a dangerous belief for any man, especially one entrusted with power. I thought of the men at the border again. If I truly believed that God watches over them, then my absence would not abandon them. If I believed that leadership is shared, then delegating was not negligence. If I believed that God orders time, then honoring His day was not waste. Responsibility and faith were no longer enemies in my mind, they were simply competing for first place. I stood once more, calmer now. The decision was forming, not as an impulse, but as alignment. I would not cancel responsibility, I would reorder it. The core message here is this. Faith does not remove responsibility. It clarifies it. It asks us to place our actions under a higher authority, even when that placement costs us certainty. In that room, I understood that obedience is not escape, it is exposure of what we truly trust. The decision did not arrive with relief. It arrived with gravity. I did not feel lighter when I chose. I felt anchored, as if something invisible had finally been set in its proper place. I understood then that peace does not always feel like comfort. Sometimes it feels like surrender. I reached for my phone and called my personal military driver. His voice was steady, respectful, alert, a man trained to respond without questions. I told him I would not be traveling with him that day. There was a brief pause on the line. Not confusion, not resistance, just silence. I asked him to take the full set of documents I had prepared and deliver them directly to the commanding officer at the Kutiala Nord sector. I instructed him to ensure that every plan was presented exactly as written, without omission, without improvisation. The work was to go on. Authority was not to be interrupted. Then I added something unusual. I told him to move quietly. No sirens, no escort formation, no announcement. A simple transfer of responsibility, nothing more. As I ended the call, I realized something subtle but profound. I had not abandoned leadership. I had trusted it. Trusted that authority does not collapse when it is shared. Trusted that obedience to God does not create chaos among men. I removed my uniform. That act carried more meaning than I expected. The fabric came off easily, but the habit of command did not. I folded it carefully with respect, not rejection. This was not a renunciation of duty. It was a pause. A real one. I dressed in simple civilian clothing, clean, modest, unremarkable. For once, I did not want to be recognized. I did not want protocol to follow me into the presence of God. I wanted to arrive as a man, not as a position. As I prepared to leave, a final doubt surfaced. What if this decision was foolish? What if something went wrong at the border? What if lives were lost and I had chosen prayer over presence? I did not dismiss that fear. Faith does not require blindness, it requires honesty. I answered the fear quietly. If something went wrong, I would still be accountable. Faith does not erase consequences. But if I disobeyed what I knew to be right, I would carry a different kind of failure, one that no report could measure. I stepped outside. The city moved as it always did. People walked, shops opened, children laughed. The world did not pause to acknowledge my choice. That too taught me something. Obedience is rarely dramatic. It is often invisible. As I made my way toward the small church, I thought of leaders I had studied. Kings, generals, presidents. Many had lost everything, not because they lacked strength, but because they forgot order. They placed success before submission, action before listening. That morning, I chose order. The core message of this moment is clear. Placing God first does not mean neglecting human responsibility. It means trusting that responsibility functions best when it is aligned, not idolized. I did not know then what the day would bring. I did not anticipate danger. I did not expect revelation. I simply chose obedience over urgency. And sometimes that is enough. The church stood quietly at the edge of the village, as it had for decades. Saint Michel des Plaines was not impressive by worldly standards. Built in the late 1950s, its walls bore the marks of time, dust, and sun. The paint had faded. The wooden doors creaked softly when opened. Nothing about the place suggested importance. And yet, as I approached it, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not urgency, not vigilance, stillness. I entered without ceremony. No one announced me. No one stood. A few elderly parishioners were already seated, their heads bowed, their faces familiar with patience. I chose a bench near the back, not to hide, but to listen. When the Mass began, it did not feel like an event. It felt like a return. The priest's voice was calm, unhurried. The readings were familiar, yet they sounded different that morning. Perhaps because I was no longer rushing through them in memory. I was present, fully. For once, my mind was not calculating outcomes or scanning threats. As the liturgy unfolded, something unexpected happened. My thoughts slowed. The constant inner noise that had accompanied me for years began to fade. Not disappear completely, but loosen its grip. I realized how rarely leaders are silent. Even in moments of rest, the mind continues to command. That morning, I allowed myself to stop commanding. When the priest elevated the host, I did not think of symbolism or theology. I thought of vulnerability, of how small a man truly is, no matter his title. I thought of Jesus Christ not as a distant figure of doctrine, but as a presence that does not compete with power because it does not need to. The peace I felt was not emotional. It was structural. As if something inside me had been realigned, I did not feel that my problems were solved. I felt that they were placed in the right order. Time passed without pressure. I did not check my watch. That alone told me something had changed. When the Mass ended, I remained seated for a moment. Not because I was reluctant to leave, but because I wanted to acknowledge what had been given. calm, clarity, a sense that obedience had opened a door I did not know existed. I left the church quietly, just as I had entered. Outside, the day continued, unchanged. But I was not the same man who had arrived. The core message here is simple. Peace does not come from escaping responsibility. It comes from standing where you are meant to stand. That morning I stood not above others, not ahead of events, but before God. And that position changed everything. I returned to my office shortly before midday. Nothing felt urgent. That was unusual. The habit of haste had loosened, but it had not disappeared. I reviewed documents calmly. I answered a few messages. Everything appeared normal. Then the call came. At first, the words did not arrange themselves into meaning. The voice on the other end spoke clearly, but my mind resisted understanding. An attack, an explosion, gunfire, the military vehicle, my driver. He had been killed instantly. I stood up, then sat down again, because my legs no longer trusted me. The room seemed distant, as if I were hearing the news from another place. I asked the same questions anyone would ask. Where? When? How? Who else was involved? The answers came, one by one, steady and factual. The vehicle had been struck near the route to the northern border. The ambush had been precise, planned. There was no doubt about the target. When the call ended, the silence was unbearable. I looked at the empty chair across from my desk. I saw his face in my mind. A man of discipline, a man with a family, a man who had followed orders without hesitation. He had taken my place without knowing it. Grief does not arrive loudly. It settles slowly like dust. Then another thought pierced through the sorrow, sharp and unavoidable. Why was I not in that vehicle? The question repeated itself, not as accusation, but as reality. I traced the morning backward, the uniform untouched, the Bible, the church, the Mass. If I had followed my plan, I would have been there. Not metaphorically, literally, the seat was meant for me. I did not interpret this as punishment diverted or fate manipulated. I interpreted it as protection, not earned, not deserved, given. I bowed my head and wept, not publicly, not ceremoniously, alone. I gave orders for a full investigation. I demanded accountability. Security failures would not be excused by tragedy. Responsibility remained. But beneath the orders, another certainty settled in me. This was not coincidence. Too many decisions, too precise, too aligned. That morning, obedience had placed me somewhere else, and that difference had spared my life. The core message of this moment is sobering. Power does not shield us. Planning does not guarantee survival. Only God sees beyond the visible path. That day, I understood something I will never forget. The Eucharist I attended was not a delay. It was a refuge. In the hours that followed, many people assumed I would speak only of survival, that I would frame the day as a narrow escape, a personal miracle. But my thoughts went elsewhere. I kept thinking about responsibility. It would have been easy to say, God saved me, therefore nothing else matters. That would have been false. Faith does not cancel duty, it sharpens it. It removes the excuses we hide behind and leaves us face to face with truth. A man had died doing what I asked him to do. His obedience had cost him his life. That reality did not disappear because I was alive. If anything, it weighed heavier. I ordered the investigation not as a formality, but as an obligation. Weaknesses had to be exposed. Errors had to be named. Mourning without accountability would have been another kind of betrayal. At the same time, something had changed in how I carried responsibility. Before that day, I believed responsibility meant carrying everything alone, every decision, every burden, every risk. I wore it like armor. After that day, I understood responsibility differently. It is not ownership of outcomes, it is stewardship under God. There is a subtle difference, but it changes everything. Ownership says, if I am not there, things will fail. Stewardship says, I must act faithfully even when I am not present. Ownership breeds fear. Stewardship breeds trust. I realized that my earlier struggle that morning had not been between work and prayer. It had been between control and obedience. I had feared that stepping away would create danger. In truth, the danger was believing that my presence was the final line of defense. Faith does not make a leader passive, it makes him precise. It forces him to ask not only what must be done, but also under whose authority am I doing it? From that day on, I stopped using faith as a private comfort and started allowing it to inform public responsibility, not as slogans, not as displays, but as orientation. I became more deliberate in delegation, more attentive to counsel, more aware that leadership is strongest when it recognizes its limits, that awareness does not weaken command, it purifies it. The core message of this moment is clear. faith is not an alternative to responsibility. It is the light by which responsibility can be carried without becoming an idol. When responsibility forgets God, it becomes arrogance. When faith forgets responsibility, it becomes escape. That day taught me that the two were never meant to be separated. After the investigations began and the first reports arrived, a pattern became clear. The attack had not been random. It had not been reckless. It had been calculated. Whoever planned it understood routes, timing, and routines. They understood power well enough to know how fragile it truly is. That realization stayed with me. For years, I had lived surrounded by layers of protection. Armored vehicles, advanced teams, secure routes, encrypted communications. These measures are necessary. Any responsible leader uses them. But slowly, without noticing, I had begun to confuse preparation with protection. That confusion is dangerous. Power creates an illusion. It suggests that if we add enough layers, we become untouchable. That if we plan thoroughly enough, we control outcomes. That illusion is comforting, especially to those entrusted with the lives of others. But it is still an illusion. The vehicle that was attacked that day was armored. The route had been assessed, the timing approved, every visible precaution had been taken. And yet, it failed. Not because those measures were useless, but because they were never meant to be ultimate. I thought again of how easily I could have been inside that vehicle. One decision, one moment of insistence, one refusal to pause, that is all it would have taken. No escort would have changed that outcome. No title would have altered it. No authority would have argued with the explosion. This is difficult for leaders to accept. Power trains us to believe we are protected by proximity to command. Faith teaches us that protection flows from proximity to God. There is a difference between security and safety. Security is constructed, safety is entrusted. I do not say this to discourage planning or vigilance. Those remain essential. I say it to remind those who lead that protection is not cumulative. You cannot stack enough precautions to replace obedience. That day stripped away a quiet arrogance I did not know I carried. Not the arrogance of prideful words, but the arrogance of assumption. The assumption that I would know when danger approached. The assumption that my judgment would always be sufficient. God did not humble me through loss of position or defeat. He humbled me through preservation, through showing me how easily I could have been removed. The core message of this moment is sobering. Power delays danger, it does not defeat it. Only God sees the paths we cannot calculate. A leader who understands this does not become fearful. He becomes reverent, and reverence changes how power is used. From that day forward, Sunday was never the same for me again. Before, it had been a technical detail on a calendar, a cultural pause, something easily overridden by urgency, crisis, or command. After that day, Sunday became something else entirely. It became a boundary, a line I no longer crossed casually, not because of fear, but because of memory. I remembered how easily I had justified postponing God, with good reasons, with noble intentions, with arguments that sounded responsible and intelligent. None of them were evil, and that is precisely why they were dangerous. I understood then that disobedience rarely arrives dressed as rebellion. It arrives dressed as necessity. From that Sunday on, I no longer saw the Eucharist as a religious obligation competing with national duty. I saw it as a source of life that makes duty possible. Without it, leadership becomes mechanical. Efficient perhaps, but hollow. I did not become less active. I did not withdraw from responsibility. I became more deliberate. I stopped scheduling over God's day unless there was absolute necessity. And even then, I did not do so lightly, because I knew what I had been spared. I knew that my life had not been preserved for comfort, but for clarity. Not to elevate myself, but to testify quietly, not with speeches, but with order. Sunday became a reminder that I am not the axis of history, that the nation does not rest on my shoulders alone, that survival itself is a gift, not an achievement. The core message of this final moment in the second part is this. Sacred time is not a luxury. It is protection. When we ignore it, we do not become more productive. We become more vulnerable. That lesson cost a man his life. It cost me my illusions. I carry both with me. I speak now not to impress and not to persuade, but to witness. What I share is not a theory formed after comfort, nor a story polished for approval. It is a memory that still carries weight in my body and clarity in my conscience. To Muslims, I speak as a man who has learned that submission is not weakness, it is alignment. When the heart bows, the path straightens. To Christians, I speak as one who stood quietly before Jesus Christ and discovered that peace is not the absence of danger, but the presence of God in the middle of it. To the leaders of the Sahel, I speak as a brother who knows the cost of command and the temptation to believe we are indispensable. We are not. To the world, I speak as a man spared not because he was clever, but because he listened. Africa does not need louder leaders. It needs ordered leaders. Leaders who understand that authority borrowed from God must be returned daily through obedience. When power forgets its source, it becomes reckless. When faith forgets responsibility, it becomes empty. Our future depends on refusing both errors. I have seen how violence thrives where reverence disappears. I have seen how corruption grows where conscience is mocked. I have also seen how quiet obedience can redirect a life, and perhaps more than one life, without fanfare. To those who have lived long enough to bury friends, to watch empires shift, to recognize that promises age quickly, I say this with respect. The world does not change because we argue louder. It changes when we reorder ourselves. Turn away from what corrodes you slowly. Pride disguised as certainty, hatred disguised as loyalty, indifference disguised as realism. These are not small sins, they are the foundations of collapse. Choose instead the harder path, humility without performance, faith without exhibition, responsibility without obsession. These do not trend, they endure. I do not ask anyone to follow me, I ask you to remember God. In your homes, in your work, in your decisions when no one is watching, sacred time is not an escape from reality, it is a return to it. If you are a leader, remember that your plans are not your protection. If you are a parent, remember that example teaches more than instruction. If you are tired, remember that rest given by God is not wasted time. If you are afraid, remember that fear loses its grip when placed under obedience. I remain a soldier, I remain a president, I remain accountable. None of that has changed. What has changed is the order in which I stand. I stand under God, and because of that, I can stand before men without illusion. If these words have stirred something quiet in you, do not ignore it. Return to what you once knew was right. Reclaim sacred ground in your own life. Speak less, listen more, order your days. I share this testimony openly because silence would be dishonest. I share it calmly because drama would be unnecessary. Take from it what is true, leave what is not. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. I say these things as truth, spoken without embellishment and without fear. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. These words are not stories, they are reality, remembered and affirmed. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. What I have said stands as truth, before God and before history. If you wish to continue reflecting on these matters with me, you are welcome to remain, to listen, and to share your thoughts in your own time. Those who wish to walk further together may do so quietly. No pressure, no urgency, only sincerity.